All in the world I wanted was for the insanity and the pain to stop. And I didn't know how to do it. And I kept trying to balance my life. My Lord, I would work on balancing my life. I even went to counseling on balancing my life. Finally, some guy I sponsored after I'd been working on balancing my life so hard for about 2 years, said, Don, what's the difference in balancing your life and managing your life? And I said, oh, well, maybe if I can't manage it, maybe I can't balance it. And the answer to that was it turned out that God can balance my life just real well if I do the next right thing. But it takes me a long time to get to that. During that period of time, I would grab a character defect by the collar, and let me assure you, it was the character defect that was causing me the most discomfort and was embarrassing me the most. And I would grab that sucker by the collar, and I would slam it up against the wall, and I'd holler, hey, God, come here. I've got him cornered. Give me a little help. Just a little help, and we'll get rid of him. I don't need much. I've got him cornered. And God never came, and I didn't know what was wrong. I didn't know what was wrong. And you may have picked up that deep down inside, doesn't come out very often and doesn't really cause much trouble, but I have a wee bit of a tendency toward grandiosity. And what I really had sort of got in my head, here I was, I'm spiritual leader to a bunch of these guys and this sort of thing. I got to think about Moses in the Promised Land. And it seemed clear to me that I was like Moses, and what was really happening was that God had gone on and let me live and let me get sober, and he was going to use me for some little things here and there, but he was going to take me up and let me look at folks that had a sane and reasonably comfortable relationship life, and look at people that had a sane and reasonably comfortable financial life, and God was going to say, Major, you didn't really think you were going to get the slide on all that crap you did you? And he was going to show that to me and say, you can never, ever have that. And I didn't know. I didn't know what was wrong. And that's where I was. Cherry died sometime around the first of the year of 1990. And I talked at a conference with a fellow from Cleveland, and Tom's given me perfect permission to use his last name, Tom Burns, from actually Avon Lake right outside of Cleveland. And in April of 90, I talked at a conference where Tom talked, and I liked what Tom said, and I said, Tom, my old authority sponsor's dead. I've got Bernie in Louisville, who's been my sponsor since I got back to Louisville, and I love Bernie, and he'll be my sponsor as long as we're both alive. But Bernie loves me too much. Bernie's become my friend. If I go to Bernie with a problem, poor Bernie's apt to want to loan me money or something. He loves me too much. I need somebody that's an authority figure that'll say, Don, anytime you make a big deal out of anything that's not God in these 12 steps, what you're really making a big deal out of is yourself. And when you do that, you're back into ego and you're back into alcoholism. So I asked Tom to be a sponsor. And I told Tom that even though things looked kind of good on the outside, if you didn't look too close and didn't start checking my personal life and my finances, that I was dying inside. And something had to be done because I couldn't stand it anymore. I was just ready to die. I didn't want to drink, but I did want to die. I was in a period that I heard Jim Williams describe one time where I would go ahead and do something like go out to a meeting and to Shoney's with folks and have coffee, and I would be waving goodbye to them and smiling and telling them that I would see them tomorrow and thinking about killing myself, just running through my head. I've always been sort of a mental suicide prone. Now, I don't think I've ever really been a risk to do it on any sort of abrupt basis. Now, I certainly was good at doing it on a long-term basis, but it was my thought process, and I wanted to die at 9 years sober with all those things going. Had a daughter that adored me. I had 30 or 40 people that I was sponsoring and really looked up to me. I was talking at conferences all over the country. I was driving new cars. I was wearing custom-made clothes, and I was dying inside, absolute dying. And I flew up to Cleveland on a weekend in May of 1990, and that's where I'm going to leave off and turn it over to, I think we're going to let Bill go next, right, Bob? Going to turn it over to Bill, and next session we'll pick it up with what happened in Cleveland in May of 1990. Bill?
Well, thank you, Don. I'm Bill, alcoholic. I talked earlier about only understanding enough of the steps to stay miserable. And I'll go through a couple periods in my recovery, but I was terrified about using alcohol and drugs. So for my first 3 years, I used the steps in meetings to not drink. My sponsor at the time said, when are you going to start using the steps to start living? And I said, what do you mean? I'm sober. And he said, yeah, but you're 100 pounds overweight and your apartment's a pigsty. And at that point, I was stuck on the third step. I said, well, it's God's will. It must be God's will, because I'm not drinking. And he said, after you eat that pint of Haagen-Dazs every night, you can't ask God then to stop your willfulness. You ask God before. God's not going to clean your house, you are. Different revelations in recovery, although painful, are what recovery is about. And I found that the more I surrender to the program and the steps, I get a better understanding of my higher power and how I can take the action to help with my behavior. Listening to Don, I don't know if he just told pretty similar here. If we keep practicing the behavior, it's not going to change. We need to look at step 6 and 7. Last week, I had the grocery store problem again. I stopped at the grocery store and filled up my basket, and I went up to check out, and there were 6 people ahead of me. And the first person wrote a check for $1, and the next person had coupons. And the next person actually visited with the clerk. And so the longer I'm waiting, the angrier I become. Because how can they have God wait in line, you see? So by the time I'm up to the register and checking out, I want to buy the building and fire everyone. Now, this is a well-balanced, serene, 19-year member of Alcoholics Anonymous. But I did not go into the grocery store with that attitude. It just happened. My character defects just happened. And by the time I was getting in my car, I was laughing at myself, using the 2 words in the 7th-step prayer, my usefulness. How useful is that anger going to be for me the rest of the day? In the old days, I would have driven fast and been angry all day just because of that, but I have had some glimpses of clarity in recovery to understand that although my character defects will come back at odd times, my impatience, grandiosity, like in the grocery store, that I can do something about that as quick as I can, so I don't have to wreck my whole day. And I need to work daily on gaining an insight into those different types of character defects I've had. As a writer, my favorite one is procrastination. Every time I write a book, they give me a due date when they want the manuscript. And I totally disregard that because I know enough about publishing that that's really not the real due date. And there's another date after the real due date called the drop dead date. So I wait till the drop dead date, always, and seem to enjoy writing when everyone's yelling at me and that we're not going to get it. It's supposed to be released this quarter, and we're not going to generate the income, and when are you going to have it done? And I have millions of excuses. I've been using a lot of excuses. I just finished 5 books that went into production, but I've been sitting on for a couple of years, and I knew my goal for 99 is to actually finish a book before I tell anyone it's about it. I have all these big ideas about a great book, and then they get it in the production schedule in the catalogs 6 months ahead of advertising, and I haven't written anything yet. So procrastination and fear. Fear's been with me all my life. I think it's a major component for people in recovery, different degrees. And there's a lot of subconscious fear I'm just becoming aware of that prevents me of engaging life. For too long in recovery, I just didn't do anything. I'd go to meetings, I wasn't very happy, but I thought this was better than the terrible things I had done prior to sobriety. Excuse my cough, but in the last 40, 50 years, there's been a common expression called drop the rock. Many people use it in their leads around conferences. I think there's Sandy Beach, who's a circuit speaker, uses a talk called Drop the Rock. It's about step 6 and 7. When I was working in the archives in New York, Nell Wing and I tried to research the origins of the story Drop the Rock. And like many things in the program, we could not find who wrote it or the origin. And I'd like to conclude my part of this second session with reading the Drop the Rock piece. Seems there was this group of 12 step members taking a boat ride to this island called Serenity. And they were truly a happy bunch of people. As the boat pulled away from the dock, a few on board noticed Mary running down the street, trying to catch up with the boat. One said, "Darn, she's missed the boat." Another said, "Maybe not. Come on, Mary, jump in the water, swim, swim. You can make it. You can catch up with us." So Mary jumped into the water and started to swim for all she was worth. She swam for quite a while and then started to sink. The members on board, now all aware that Mary was struggling, shouted, "Come on, Mary, don't give up, drop the rock." With that encouragement, Mary started swimming again, only to start sinking again shortly afterwards. She was going under when she heard all those voices shouting to her, "Mary, drop the rock, let go and drop the rock." Mary was vaguely aware of something around her neck, but she couldn't quite figure out what it was. Once more she gathered her strength and started swimming. She was doing quite well, even gaining a little on the boat, but then she felt this heaviness pulling her under again. She saw all those people on the boat holding out their hands and hollering for her to keep swimming and shouting, "Don't be an idiot, Mary, drop the rock." Then she understood. When she was going down for the third time, this thing around her neck, this was why she kept sinking when she really wanted to catch the boat. This thing was the rock they were all shouting about. Resentments, fear, dishonesty, self-pity, intolerance, and anger. Just some of the things her rock was made of. God help me get rid of the rock, she prayed. Now, get rid of it. So Mary managed to stay afloat long enough to untangle a few of the strings holding that rock around her neck, realizing as she did that her load was easing up. And then, with another burst of energy, she let go. She tore the other strings off and dropped the rock. Once free from the rock, she was amazed how easy it was to swim, and she soon caught up with the boat. Those on board were cheering for her and applauding and telling her how great she was and how it was so good having her with them again, and how now we can get on with our boat ride and have a nice time to the island of Serenity. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bob, and I'm alcoholic. A story not dissimilar from the rock story is how I distinguish a normal person and an alcoholic. And you take a room and you put a normal person and an alcoholic in it. Out one door is a person with a baseball bat that will hit you over the head if you open the door, and out the other door is happiness forever after. And a normal person will go over to the door and open it up and get hit on top of the head and come back in. And then they'll get up and they'll go over to the door and they'll have happiness forever after. An alcoholic goes over to the door, opens it up, gets hit on top of the head, gets knocked down, and comes back in. And then they get up and they go back over to the door and they get hit on top of the head and they get knocked down. And then they get up and they go over to the door and they get hit on top of the head. They go back and they go over to the door and they get hit on top of the head. And one time when they go over to the door, the person with the bat's missing, so they go looking for him. There's we seem to have a persistence with some of that. I got sober when I was 24 years old, and I've spent the last almost 31 years in AA, and I've had to learn how to live in Alcoholics Anonymous. When I came to AA, I was really hopeful. Everybody was looking for an explanation for why I was kind of screwed up and why I seemed to be unable, though reasonably well equipped, to perform. I could get jobs, I just couldn't do the jobs. I interview well. My mother always said, "Bob, you're not very bright, dress well." And, I'm open for tips, so I am. That's probably not what she said, that's probably just what I heard. And, but I mean, I had a sister who was who went to the Sorbonne in graduate school, and her brother was Phi Beta Kappa in law school, and I was, kind of the person in between, didn't look very good, had high hopes, and then kept, I was tested the best of the 12 guys that went from my high school to Notre Dame. I was the only one who didn't finish. I do interview well until recently, and I could get jobs, but I literally had trouble performing them. And so now I'm sober, and I'm real active in Alcoholics Anonymous. I just love it. I'm doing the steps to the 4th and 5th step, and but I had other issues that were going on in my life. I had problems getting up in the morning. Set the alarm clock for 6:45 and get up 7:45. It's supposed to be work at 8. Tough for an alcoholic to do that, but we're quick, so we kind of get there. I got money problems. I'm spending $200 or $300 more a month than I made, and you do that over a long period of time, you end up in debt. And I got work problems. I have trouble getting to work. I have trouble staying at work. I don't know. I have trouble figuring out what to do, when to do it. I'm going out for 3 or 4 hour AA lunches because anytime or anywhere the hand of AA reaches out, I'm responsible to do that. And I'm sponsoring people. I'm going to 5 or 6 meetings. Linda and I are starting to have some arguments. She's going to Al-Anon, and she's starting to wonder if one of the places I'm supposed to practice the principles is in our home. It's none of your business. You've got your program. Should be happy I'm sober, and we're seeing less of each other married than we were dating. Because I'm, she's a nurse. She's getting up at 6 to go to work at 7, and I'm still in bed, and I'm coming home at midnight from AA meetings, and, we're like ships passing in the night. And we started to have children. We have three. We have a 29, almost 30-year-old, a 28-year-old, and or 27-year-old, and an 18-year-old. And, I think being a parent takes 125% of whatever you have. It's just a big job, and it will, it's one of life's great opportunities, but it's also one of life's great challenges. And I was loud, angry, impatient, immature, and sometimes violent with my children. And I'm not pleased or happy or proud of that, but that, I think, was especially an accurate description of my earlier years. That's a pattern. One of the things I've been able to do in my family is break the pattern of alcoholism, a lot of alcoholism over the generations. And my father got sober and my brothers got sober, and that's been kind of a gift. Not just my recovery, but a recovery in a family alters the way people see, the disease. And one of the gifts, there's also been issues which I don't think are uncommon in the world of anger and rage in our family. And one of the things I would like to contribute in that process is I would like to break that cycle, which isn't uncommon. But I had that cycle, and it was very difficult for me. And I gambled. I gambled a lot. More like a hobby. It was 4 or 5 hours a day, 3 or 4 days a week. And I was making almost $10,000 a year playing backgammon. And I thought I was going to be a professional backgammon player. I thought, like a second job. Okay. Now, I had these issues, and I didn't have them, annually. I had them daily. I had every one of these issues in my first year of sobriety, and I never noticed them. My first year of sobriety was like a honeymoon. I came in, I was focused on my alcoholism, I learned about the steps, I got active. Warren McGinley and Bill Berman were my sponsors. Warren's my main guy, and I just couldn't have run into a more perfect guy for me to be my sponsor. I kind of vibrated. Warren very laid back, and together we were like a normal resonance, between us. And Warren was one of the champion 12-steppers at Uptown, and, he was active in service, and he was, gave talks, and he had me going to jails, and very early on I got active in just about every aspect of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it just couldn't have been anything better for me to do than to get involved in that. But about the end of my first year, I started to get a sense of, as I say, my first inventory was more about my grossest behaviors, the things that I had to kind of cleanse myself from guilt. But I started to get a sense of what my defects of character were and get in touch with what a program was. And I think my whole second year of sobriety was kind of putting those two things together. What did God and sobriety have to do with Wednesday? And, start to do, and then starting to identify issues that I had to deal with in my sobriety, as problems arise. And, one by one, I'm glad they didn't come all on one day, because I, think I would have exited. One by one, I started to get in touch with these defects of character, and one by one, I kind of took them on and tried to help manage them, like Don talked about. And didn't make much progress. I'd make a little progress here, a little progress there. I'd start to work on work. I'd start to work on money. I'd start to, try to be a better parent, try to be, have a better relationship with Linda, try to stop gambling, or at least lower the time that I did it, deal with my anxiety and fear. And overall, it really was pretty damn difficult. And by my second and third year, I was really had these things, right up in front of my face. And, for a guy who's been a great starter and a poor finisher, I started to get a sense like, maybe this is going to happen to you in Alcoholics Anonymous. Now all of a sudden I'm active in service, I'm giving talks, I'm sponsoring people, but, I'm starting to see people I sponsor make more progress than I'm making. I'm starting to have arguments at home that I don't want to bring into the meetings, And probably the largest event in my early sobriety was the tearing down of my alibi system and the wall that I built up between me and you. We need protection. We can't be out there bare naked showing our flaws to everybody. So when I started to not do enough to get by in my early life, I built a wall up so that I could, behind that wall, I could hide the things I didn't want you to see. And the idea was, is you like me, but you only like what I let you see about me. If you could see everything about me, you'd hate me because I hate me. And who knows more what a lousy, insufficient, crummy person I am than me. I'm walking around comparing my inside with your outsides. behind that wall, you're unique. If you're truly unique, in Alcoholics Anonymous, you're going to die. You have to lose enough of that uniqueness to be able to identify with the other people in recovery. You aren't going to believe that what worked in their life will work in yours. And we have time and time again seen people who have chronic alcoholism come to us that are not able to lose enough of their uniqueness to be able to have the gift of recovery. They will not identify. And for whatever reason, it's just, they are just blind. It is a painful and deadly thing. Clancy talks about, if there ever was a flag that we could all pledge our allegiance to, the flag would say, "But I'm different." We have a keen, strong sense of difference that in many cases is what we use to exempt ourselves from the process that other people go through. And it was necessary for me early in my recovery to tear that wall down. Now, when I tore my wall down, I started it when I called Alcoholics Anonymous. I continued it in conversation with my sponsor, and I totally dissembled it when I took my fifth step, and I made a discovery, is that I'm not unique. My personality may be unique, but not my illness, not my behavior, not my feelings, not my experience. When I tore that wall down, I had a sense that what worked in Joe's life or in Warren's life or in your life could work in mine. I really had a sense that I was in the right place. Now what happened to me, and I didn't really know it, is it was like I died. It was like all my life what I wanted is someone who knew Bob so well they could look through Bob and tell me exactly what to do. Someone who had deep insight into Bob. I never found that. What happened to me is I surrendered. I tore my wall down and I became an alcoholic. At the time I became an alcoholic, I was surrounded by tens of teachers. There were plenty of people who knew an awful lot about alcoholism. And for a period of time, I would ask a question and I'd get an answer. It was just this wonderful period where I was open and I was just like a little sponge. I would just take all this stuff in and it applied to me, and that was my honeymoon. My honeymoon was I was no longer kind of concerned with Bob. I had all these issues going on, and I was given a blessed period of, I was just given this period where I was open enough that I became just kind of consumed with Alcoholics Anonymous, and I think that was necessary for me to build my foundation and to get kind of impregnated into AA. But a funny thing happened to me in my recovery is that as I started to go through recovery and I started to have things in sobriety that I didn't think I should have, I started to rebuild my wall. So now I'm in my second or third or fourth or fifth year of sobriety. And again, I want to emphasize what Don said. We're talking about problems in sobriety. It'll sound like my sobriety was horrible. I don't think my sobriety was horrible. I wouldn't go back and change any part of it. We're talking about a process. You don't see it clearly when you're going through it, and in retrospect, you have more freedom to talk about it. Focusing on are problems, because problems are where the opportunities are. There were plenty of good things. There were plenty of wonderful things. There was growth, there was recovery, and there were issues. But as I started to go through, and I had a strong relationship with my sponsor, but I was only telling my sponsor about 65% of what was going on. I mean, the fact is I was only telling myself about 75% of what was going on. I mean, I was unable to, we used a lot of denial. We used a lot of suppression. I mean, that stuff does not live in an open environment. I mean, you have to, if you're out of integrity with yourself, there's pain involved in that. So you have to, somehow deal with that. And to resolve most of us use denial. We just, we submerge it. Do not have it, it's just our problems live, like, how's everything? Oh, it's just fine, but you've got this monster who lives in the garage. Once in a while you open the garage door, the monster comes out, takes you over for 2 or 3 days, and then lets you go, goes back in the garage, and then someone asks you on Thursday, how are you? And you say, gee, I'm fine. Kind of this little lapse, but it's in the garage now, and I think it's okay. It's just, so Warren's helping me as best he could. The other thing is I had such high ideals, which are good and bad, and I was an idealist. And I was pretty hard on myself. Now that I'm 55 years old and I'm sponsoring people who are in their 20s and 30s, I know that Warren didn't expect me to be problem-free. I was the one who expected me to be problem-free, not Warren. So what I thought he was just too laid back and really didn't get it and didn't quite understand. I suspect that people that I sponsor sometimes think the same about me. And our sponsorship has not been that kind of harsh directive sponsorship that I don't want to sound negative about that. I think there are different styles of sponsorship, and ours was not as directive, telling someone to do it. It was more on a sharing basis and talking about the steps and the application of the principles, and was what Warren and I had together. So I'm struggling with these issues, and when I've always been concerned what people think of me, and so I would, didn't want people to know I was having money problems, so I was the guy that would always buy if we went out for coffee afterwards. My checking account might be $20 overdrawn, but I'd write the check for dinner, and I'm the guy in the new suit who just charged a $400 sport coat after I had a $300 bill at the clothing store, this is just the way I was with money. I'm constantly spending money I don't have to buy things I don't need to impress people I don't like. And with each of these issues, I would say thank you very much for helping with my drinking problem, but stay out of my marriage, stay out of my sex life, stay out of my finances, stay out of my parenting, stay out of my work, stay out of my gambling. Not even consciously, but brick by brick, sober, going to 5 or 6 meetings a week. I built my wall back up. So I found myself, 6 or 7 years sober, emotionally isolated in Alcoholics Anonymous, where people were telling me what a great job I was doing, asking me to give talks at a conference or talks at a meeting and stuff like this, and there were things that I was doing well, and I had this part of me saying, God, can't you, I'm going to meetings with you 4 or 5, can't you see what's really going on? Well, 2 things were going on. Number one is a lot of people couldn't see what was going on, and some people saw what was going on, and still it was okay. I was imperfect, I thought I was trying to look perfect, they saw the imperfection. Who doesn't have imperfections, so they were, my wall was made of, glass. I thought it was made of bricks, and it was tough to see through a glass wall, but you can see through it. But what happens is when Bill talked about that he got just well enough or just active enough with the steps to feel miserable, that's what happens in the process. I felt like in recovery like I was going backwards. What was happening to me is that you were getting me more honest with myself. You were reducing my ability to deny and suppress. And so I started to, every once in a while I'd get a whiff of peanuts, and then I'd see a little straw on the floor, and then pretty soon I started to get an idea like maybe there was an elephant in the room. It took me a while. Everybody else was pretty sure that there was this, why do you think the furniture is arranged the way it is, Bob? It's kind of, and, but as you started, I love Chinese, I love some of the Eastern truths, and one of the great Zen stories is about a man who comes to the master for help, and the master comes in and sits him down, and the man who's asking for help is a very educated, very bright, guy, and as the master humbly goes over to serve him tea, he keeps pouring the tea into the cup, and it overflows, and it starts to spill all over the floor, and finally the guy says to the master, stop, it's full, there's no room, and the master said yes. And he said, there is no room to put tea into a full cup. The process of growth and the process of spiritual growth is the process of removing to create a space to put something in. When most of us come to the program, we are full. We aren't empty. If we feel empty, because we're not nurtured, it is nutrient deprived. But the fact is that there is no room to put anything in. The process of surrender is what empties us out, to have room to put something in. And that's what happened to me early in sobriety. As I started to go on, my ego came back to life, and I started to fill myself up with my neurosis and my fears and my anxieties. I still was interactive with the program, and I started to have less room. I was looking again at 5 and 6 and 7 years of sobriety for an expert on Bob. Starting to think that maybe with my problems of 7 years of sobriety, maybe I ought to go to Gamblers Anonymous, maybe I ought to go to Spenders Anonymous, maybe I ought to go, because I've got these issues. Maybe it's not going to work for me. Maybe I'm a good, a great starter and a poor finisher, and I'm just not able to do it. And I'm feeling worse about myself at 7 or 8 years of sobriety because you've gotten me well enough that I can't hide it, but not well enough that I know how to deal with it. And I thought, you get me well from alcoholism and I'll deal with my sex life. I'll deal with everybody knows how to work. You don't have to teach me how to work. Well, I didn't know how to work. Everybody knows how to be a husband. I didn't, I guess I didn't know exactly how to be. I had a pretty good model. My father was an excellent model. But I wasn't able to do these things, and yet I knew what to do. It was even doubly painful for me that most of these areas of my life, I had good models. I knew what to do. I just couldn't do it. And time again, I get people who come over to my house, and there's problems, and they sit down, and for an hour they'll share, their broken toys. Every once in a while I'll say to someone, close your eyes, and pretend that I came to your house and just told you exactly what you communicated to me. Tell me what to do. They always know. We all know what to do. We just can't do it. Knowledge is not the answer. We do not have the power to do it. We're responsible. It is our lives. We are participants in the process, but we lack the power. We have information, but we don't know the information in a way that truly makes a difference. There's a difference between knowing it, and there's a difference between knowing it in a way that makes a difference. And there are certain distinctions in our program. And the power of our program comes through our weakness. We have to empty ourselves out in some way to be able to put the principles in action in our lives. It's the touching of our hearts that alters. This is not a linear process. It is not a didactic process. It is not just an insightful process. There is something that has to change in our hearts. Most of the problems that we have, one of the great reasons that it is so difficult, I'm kind of wandering, but it's the touching of our hearts that alters. This is not a linear process. It is not a didactic process. It is not just an insightful process. There is something that has to change in our hearts. Most of the problems that we have, one of the great reasons that it is so difficult, I'm kind of wandering, but if I were to ask everybody, how many people would like to get rid of the things that are hurting their lives? I think almost all of us would raise our hands and say, I would like to get rid of them. How many of us would like to get rid of the things that are hurting the people in our lives that we love? I'd raise my hand. Okay. Well, I'll tell you, it's taken me a long time to find out that that's not true. It's true at one level, but it's definitely not true at another. I jokingly say that, pretend right now that I'm talking about a sponsee of mine that's 35 years old, and he's ready to do a fourth and fifth step. And the fourth and fifth step are kind of difficult. The fourth step's got all those columns and all that stuff in the book, and it's, a lot of stuff to do. And so sometimes what I say to him, jokingly, they say, okay, let's not go through all that. I got another way that I'm trying out, and I'd like to try it on you. Okay, get your mom and dad, and your brother and a sister, your boss, 2 AA members, and your wife, and your kids, a neighbor, and 2 creditors, and bring them over to the house. And serve coffee, and here's what I'd like you to say. Okay, we have this step in AA that helps us get in touch with my defects of character and my problems, and I'm having trouble doing that, and I wondered if you'd help. You know why we laugh at that? We wouldn't call that meeting. Do you know why? We don't want to change. But it's even worse than that. We don't even want to know. We train each other. We train our wives. We're not talking about that. Nod your head up and down if you understand we are not discussing that. If you want to discuss that, it's going to be expensive. Okay. If you want to discuss that, we're going to discuss something else. We train our kids as to what they can say to us and what they can't say to us. It isn't as if there isn't some effort put forth in protecting our defects of character. some effort putting forth in things that don't work in our lives. One of the reasons we hang on to these seeming treasures is what we have the problems filed under answer in our computer. Okay, anger at some point in time in your life when you wake up is a problem. But anger, for a hell of a lot of us, is a tool. It intimidates. It keeps people away. It helps you not have certain conversations that you don't want to have. You start training each other in the AA group. Look, I won't call you on your crap. You don't call me on mine. Okay, we'll talk about the steps. We'll talk about the traditions. We'll go to meetings together. But you stay the hell out of my stuff, okay? Don't get in my underpants. I won't get in yours. Okay? So the gamblers hang out with the gamblers, and the chasers hang out with the chasers, and the money spenders hang out with the money spenders, and we got a deal. Okay, we'll do the activity, but let's not, and there are boundaries. It isn't our job to call it isn't our job to take each other's inventory. But what I'm trying to say to you is that my problems, while they look easy for you to solve, are difficult for me to solve. They are my tools. My problems are my answers to previous issues. And when your only tool is a screwdriver, everything looks like a screw. It does. If your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I mean, and many of us have been going through life with one tool in our tool belt, and it doesn't work very well. And there's an enormous amount of fear to get rid of, my treasures, my tools. I can go back and show you instance after instance where anger, I thought, worked, and where anger was appropriate, where it worked in my parenting or worked, nonsense, absolute nonsense. I can go back and rationalize certain money spending decisions that I made and work issues that I made, nonsense. But the fact is that alcoholism is not just physical, it's mental, it's emotional, and it's spiritual. I was told that the physical part of alcoholism was 10% of the deal. What we do is we use the 12 steps of the recovery program to work on once we are sober, and once we are straight, to work on the emotional and mental and spiritual aspects of the disease. And I think that's a lifetime job. And I think that, there's something very wrong with someone who needs a pint or a fifth a day to put themselves in the kind of condition that makes life tolerable. But when you put that pint down, the problem doesn't go away. Actually, it's back. And it's right in front of your nose. And for many of us, or for all of us, I believe that in order to have the kind of serenity and peace and recovery that we need in life, in order to find in life, in order to find in recovery what we were looking for in a bottle, we have to alter certain conditions and certain behaviors and certain way of looking at things. In order to do that, we have to empty out enough of the glass to have enough room to put something that's different back in. A different, it isn't what we know. It's what we don't know, and what we don't know that makes the difference. When we came in Alcoholics Anonymous, there was all sorts of stuff. You know what you don't know. You may not know much about the quantum theory of physics, but you don't know it. But when you come in, most of the things that made a difference in my recovery, I didn't know and didn't even know I didn't know. I would not have been able to put them on a list for me. I would not have known about the element of the depth of fear in my life that Bill talked about. I would not have known about denial and suppression. Those were things that I didn't know about. I would not have known about the principles of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and how to put them in action in my life. And those are the things that make the qualitative difference in our recoveries. And those are the things that I think it takes, when we're talking about problems in recovery, all I'm telling you is that you are not going to get it all done in a year or 2 years. And I think for most people who have the disease of alcoholism, somewhere between 5 and 10 years, your ass is going to fall off. And what happens is that the your alcoholism goes underground and starts to major in certain areas of your life. Each of us have 1 or 2 areas of specialization that are causing us great difficulty. Some of us are generalists and we got it everywhere, but most of us are specialists. Okay? And that sooner or later, your nose will have to get pressed up against almost like a second level surrender, a second level recovery, where you start to deal with the causes and conditions of your alcoholism. And I think that that is where step 6 and 7 become like taking step 1 with your life. It is a resurrender, a reopening, a reordering, and a removal of certain things that are not so, that create the opportunity for us to make the change that I think makes the next quantum leap in recovery. And when we come back after lunch, we'll start talking about that.
Is this excellent or what? We're going to have lunch now, and if you'd all just kindly take a few minutes to let the girls in the lunch team put that together and go over and form a line, and you can get some lunch. But take a little time. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'm still Don and still an alcoholic. And I just keep wanting to do this. Will you guys do the Serenity Prayer with me one more time? God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. All right. Well, we sort of left it with all of us in a really bad spot. We'd been sober an aggregate of, I think, about 25 years, and we were just beating our heads into walls, and it seemed terrible. But I do want to repeat what we've all said. Don't want any new folks to get the idea that the early part of our sobriety wasn't good. We're looking back on it now. If we had known how bad those things were, we might not have been able to stand it at the time, but we didn't know. And although at the end I certainly knew mine were getting pretty bad. And something I want to say too, because sometimes I forget to say this, I'm going to talk about some things that have been solutions for me that didn't start until I had been sober 9 years. And I'm going to talk about the fact that I was told by some people with an awful lot of long-term good sobriety that anywhere 8 to 10 years is when most folks run into the wall and begin to start really looking at 6 and 7. But what I need to tell you is that they made it very clear to me that you don't have to wait until you've been sober 8 or 10 years. That if you're one of those rare alcoholics who can learn by secondary experience, you might be able to short-circuit some of those things. What happened to me, I believe, happened because I sort of blew past 6 and 7. I didn't know I was blowing past 6 and 7. I thought I was doing what I needed to do on 6 and 7. And you know, the truth was there all along. As far as I'm concerned, I can't really talk about 6 and 7 without talking about step 3, for instance, because the truth was right there. It just took me those extra steps, and in my case, it took me that pain to get there. So where I've left it is that I'm having all these terrible problems with relationships with the opposite sex and financial chaos. And incidentally, those were not the only 2 areas in my life where I was having problems. I was having lots of other problems, and I'm praying for these character defects to be removed. And what I was doing, I would take my character defects like they were a big box of chocolates, and I would stick it under God's nose, and I would say, "Here, God, get rid of this one, 3rd one over, 3rd row down, take it now." And God didn't seem like he wanted any candy at the time, because God never took them. And Lord, I was making lists. Bill has mentioned procrastination. I believe that now that I've been sober a little while, I have suffered more from procrastination in my life than I ever suffered from booze and dope. And I want to tell you that procrastination has not been lifted out of me, but there were some things that I wound up being able to do. See, I kept trying to figure out the pattern. Lord, I would sit down and I would do inventories on procrastination, and I would talk to people about it. In fact, I've kept what I called an action inventory that I did in 1985. And a friend of mine looked at it and said, "My God, Don, that's life-changing." And you know, he was exactly right. But Bob hit the nail on the head. I go back and look at that thing occasionally. If I had been able to do everything that was on that inventory that I did in 1985, that parade of horribles in sobriety that I talked about earlier wouldn't happen to me. Because I knew that it was right there in that inventory. I knew what I needed to do, but I just wasn't able to do it. And I'd make these lists, and I'd try to figure out what to do about it. And I was trying to figure it out in all these different areas of my life. And I told you where I got to. So what happened was in May of 1990, I decided that I would, and the way that happened is kind of a neat story. I didn't have any intention of going to Cleveland. A couple of weeks earlier, I had asked Tom if he would be a sponsor, and Tom had said, "Oh, sure." And a couple of weeks later, I opened up the local newspaper in Louisville, and there was a full-page ad that Continental Airlines had a round trip to Cleveland for, I think, $56. So I thought, well, what the heck? Maybe I need to go to Cleveland. So I called Tom and let him know I was coming and reiterated that my rear end was absolutely on fire and I was dying. So I flew to Cleveland. Now, I don't play golf, but that weekend there had been an AA golf tournament for folks in AA in Cleveland and Akron. And they have got some old timers up there. At that time, Tom had been sober 29 years, and these guys treated him like a newcomer. There was one old boy there that weekend who had drank with Dr. Bob. I didn't actually have any real conversation with him, but he was around. And Tom gathered up a group of these guys and met me at the airport with some of them. And we didn't get out of the airport before one of them had made that statement that I referred to earlier. Said, "Oh yeah, sober about 9 or 10 years. That's about the time most folks begin to look at steps 6 and 7. Well, my mouth fell open because here I am doing all these things, and I had literally listened to over 50 fifth steps by that time. And I had told over 50 people, now you go home, you get the big book down from the shelf, you spend 1 hour going over the first 5 proposals, you make sure you're ready, and then you look very closely at those 2 paragraphs on page 76 that the big book devotes to 6 and 7. And then when you're ready, you get down on your knees and do the 7th step prayer, and then you go do the first half of step 8 and call me, and we'll start talking about getting you willing to make those amends. So I couldn't imagine that I needed to look at 6 and 7 because after all, you know, I was kind of a wheel around on that sort of thing. And before I left there that weekend, I had begun to realize, and you know, the word realize began to become important to me at that time. Bob was mentioning the things that he knew but that he didn't really know, that he didn't really have. He hadn't internalized them. Well, what's begun to work for me on that is understanding that the word realize is a form of the word real. And you know, I've been a word monger all my life. That's the way I've gotten through life, is with words. And I guess if somebody had asked me the question, does the word realize come from the word real, I probably would have thought about it a second and said yes. But as far as really being conscious of that, I wasn't. And I wasn't conscious that when I realize something, that is the process of making that real to me. And Lord, that's so different than knowing it. Because you see, when I went to Cleveland that weekend, I not only could have quoted the 7th step prayer to you, if you'd given me 5 minutes and sat down at a table with me, I could have quoted it beginning with the last word first and going backwards. I knew just exactly what that 7th step prayer said. I knew what the literature says on the 7th step, 6th and 7th step. I knew what the big book, which wasn't much. I knew what the 12 and 12, which is more, said about it. But I didn't realize what it was. And what happened that weekend, just a lot of miracles began to happen that weekend. The first thing was the beginning of a realization that I truly didn't know what 6 and 7 were. You see, and by the way, Bob and I were talking about this at lunch. There's a chance that some of you guys might get the impression from what we say and the way we say it that the 3 of us are saying different things about 6 and 7, but give that some prayer, because I really don't think we are. I really think we're coming down to the same thing with just different ways of saying it. But you see, After I'd done my fourth and fifth step, I had formed a picture, as I said, of what a spiritual dawn would look like. Now, I knew from having done my third step, but I didn't realize, but I knew that God's never going to give me any glimpse of God's will except in the right now. See, when I approached the third step, my sponsor had to straighten me out on that, because kind of what I thought the third step was going to be was God and me going in a room and God unfolding the entire tapestry of my life. And I had this idea that God and I would walk up and down it, and I really thought I'd probably point out a few things, and God would say, yeah, gee, Don, I never thought of that. That's good. We'll do it that way. And so the deal was that once I got all these patterns straight, see, you know, the big book says when it talks about the third step that the first thing we have to do is quit playing God. It doesn't work. Well, for me, what playing God is when I'm trying to figure out the patterns of my life. And I have spent so much time trying to figure out the patterns, and I'm 54 years old now, and I've never figured out a single pattern right. I don't understand why I insist on continuing to waste that energy, because the only glimpse of God's will that I ever get is in the right now, in the instant. In other words, where to take the next stitch. If I'll be still and leave those patterns up to God, and they belong to God, and I'll listen to where God wants me to take that next stitch, I'm convinced that that little thing inside me, that conscience, that wee small voice, that spark of the divine, whatever you want to call it, it'll tell me precisely where to stitch. But God's not ever going to share the patterns with me. And the fact is, when I start trying to comprehend the patterns, I'm worse off than a chimpanzee trying to master quantum physics. Folks, I just hadn't got the material. I haven't got the capacity to grasp any more of God's will than the next right thing, but somehow I'd lost that. I didn't have the realization of it. And having done my fourth and fifth step, I'd formed this picture of what a spiritual dawn would be. And I immediately, after going back home after the fifth step and getting down on my knees and doing the seventh step prayer, I immediately went to work on my character defects. Now, I was far enough along that I did know that I had to have God's help. And that's when I began that process that I've described that was so frustrating for all those years of working so hard on those character defects and not getting anywhere. And you know, the truth is that for that 9 years, my real objective was to get rid of the character defects that were inconsistent with what I had decided I ought to be, and particularly to get rid of those character defects that were making me uncomfortable, that were embarrassing me. And I knew the words of that prayer, but I didn't realize that when that prayer says, God, please remove from me every single defect that stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows, it means just exactly that. And here's the clincher, folks. I don't know which ones they are. In my self-centeredness, all I know is what's making me uncomfortable, and I want to be done with it. And if you really think about it, I don't think any of the three of us would be sitting up here today having anything to share with you guys if we hadn't been beaten to death by character defects that persisted so deep into sobriety and persisted so much longer than we just knew that they ought to be gone. Character defects that embarrassed us, that beat us to death. And I certainly wasn't thinking about, well, gee, God is molding me to help some folks perhaps in Minnesota in 1998. I was thinking, man, God, this is embarrassing. You know, this is terrible. I'm going to die. My butt's on fire. What can I do? You know, this has got to go. So I'm praying, oh, God, please take away this character. I'm doing the seventh-step prayer. God, take away this character defect because it's making me uncomfortable. You know, in the meantime, part of my morning meditation for all those years was reading what the book says on step 11, and I was reading every morning that many of us have wasted a lot of time praying for our own selfish ends, and it doesn't work. You can easily see why. It took me 9 years to understand that if I'm praying for a character defect to be gone because it's keeping me from being what I think I ought to be, and because it's making me uncomfortable, I might as well be praying for there to be a bright red Ferrari in my driveway when I wake up tomorrow. It ain't going to work. I'm praying for my own selfish ends because my illness is self-centeredness. I can't treat self-centeredness successfully with more self-centeredness, regardless of how spiritually I dress up that new self-centeredness. You know, for me to be comfortable and me to be spiritual for my own purposes, for my own comfort, is no less selfish than me wanting to be chairman of the board of General Motors. And it took me so long to see that, so long to realize it. Well, then they started telling me that the whole thing, that I had it all backwards. They started talking to me about perfection. Well, I had had my relationship and my problem with perfection exactly wrong for 9 years sober and for all those years before I got sober. Because up until May of 1990, I was absolutely convinced that my problem with perfection was my inability to attain perfection. And folks, I want to tell you that my inability to attain perfection has never been a factor or an issue in my life. For the very simple reason that my problem runs a whole bunch deeper than that. I can't recognize perfection. You see, the fact is, if God gave me the power right now to become anything that I thought I ought to become, I would be like a blind dog in a meat house. I wouldn't have any idea of what I ought to make out of myself. So they were telling me in Cleveland that I had to let go of those things. They were telling me that if I was going to if the 6th and 7th step were going to work for me, that I was going to have to understand that where the 12 and 12 says, of myself I'm nothing, the Father does the work, and where the big book refers to that in Bill's story, that it means just exactly that. See, I knew those things were there. I knew that of myself I'm nothing, the Father does the work was right there, but my brain edited it. My brain is just a marvelous editor, and it does it spontaneously. And the way my brain edited that was to make it read that of myself I'm not enough, and I have to have some help from God. And I want to tell you, I found out the hard way that it means what it says. Of myself I'm nothing, the Father does the work. It's just like with my drinking booze problem. They have to be lifted out of me by God. There's a story about Chuck Chamberlain, who along with Bob here is one of my heroes, and Chuck Chamberlain supposedly visited a treatment center in California one time, and because of who he was, they said, "Oh, Chuck, will you sit in with small group?" And he said, "Sure." Well, Chuck didn't get to the point where he thought necessarily that profanity was not a sign of spiritual growth. In his day, there was more profanity in the program, and Chuck sat there as long as he could stand it, and then finally he jumped up and he said, "Gee, idiot, don't you know you're going to kill these people? They are alcoholics. You're talking about dealing with fear. You're talking about dealing with resentment. You're talking about dealing with these things. Don't you know alcoholics can't deal with that? They've got to do the steps and lay it at God's feet and have it removed from them, or they'll die if they keep trying to deal with it." And that's exactly the way it turned out for me. It turned out for me that 6 and 7 weren't where I went to work on my character defects with God's help to make me into what I thought I ought to be. 6 and 7 were where I let go of the idea of what I thought I ought to be, and where I stopped the activity. You see, I had activity confused with action. I was going through all that activity, making those lists, talking over and over. You know, I don't think any of us ever quite get rid of the myth that we can talk ourselves well. The great myth, I think, that somehow we've gotten in our society is that if we can figure out just exactly what's wrong with us, then that's the whole key. Magically, it won't be wrong anymore. And that's a bunch of bull, because like I said, I did that action inventory in 1985, and I figured out just exactly what was wrong with me. I just didn't have the solution. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't willing to take that step of laying myself at my God's feet and saying, "Hey, I'm coming as a little child," just like that other book says. And I believe that for me, for these steps to work, I need to come to all of them as a little child. If I go into an inventory believing I know what I need to write in that inventory, I'm not going to get a valid inventory. But if I go into that inventory understanding that All my life I have been obsessed with what makes me tick. My Lord, I found it the most interesting subject I could think of. And I've spent all this time trying to figure me out, and I've made as big a mess of it as I can possibly imagine, so I can't take my inventory. But I can follow these simple instructions that are in this book, and if I follow those instructions one step at a time, a miracle's going to happen. My inventory is going to emerge. This book and God are going to do for me what I can't do for myself. And it turned out that 6 and 7 were that way for me, that what they were telling me was I needed to lay all of myself at God's feet. And I needed to say to my God, God, I don't know where we are. I don't know how we got here. And I sure don't know where we're going or how to get there. But what I am going to do, even though I'm feeling scared to death, I'm going to put my hand in yours, and I'm going to act like I trust that you're going to show me just where to take the next step. And I'm going to walk along with you one step at a time without trying to figure out the map, because I think I've finally got it that the map's none of my business and I don't have the capacity to comprehend the map. Well, when they told me that, I had several ready responses. There were a couple of clear reasons why that wouldn't work. The first one was that, my God, I'm not a saint. You guys are telling me to go back to Louisville and to become this saintly thing that isn't trying to make himself comfortable, that isn't trying to make himself spiritual, doesn't care if God wants to make him a missionary in China or wants him to stand on the corner and pass out Bibles. And one of them mentioned, if it's God's will, you'll like passing out Bibles on the corner. If it's God's will, you'll like China. But I said, I can't do that. I'm not that selfish, selfless. My God, you're talking about sainthood here. And same old thing, those of you that heard my story last night, it's the same thing that's had to happen to me with every step. They said, Don, you've got that backwards too. What you're telling us is you can't feel like a person who is all that saintly and is not concerned with themselves and their comfort and their spirituality. He said, you go back to Louisville and you start acting like a person would act. If a person had laid themselves at God's feet and their purpose wasn't to make them well, their purpose wasn't to make them whole, their purpose wasn't to make them spiritual, but their purpose was just to do the next right thing and trust that their God would make of their life whatever their life should be. So you go back and act that way and it'll work just fine. My second obvious objection was, my God, you're telling me to quit working on my character defects. You look at this. You look at the record. I have worked as hard as I could for the last 9 years, and it's still a terrible mess. If I quit working on them, it'll be awful. It'll overwhelm me. And they said, Don, when you turned booze and dope over to God, did you give yourself permission to take a drink or some dope if you wanted to? And I said, no. And they said, same principle here. Said, you're really going back to your third step. And they said, Don, the problem with this 6th and 7th step thing is that it is so simple that it is almost impossible for most of us to grasp it. They said, when you do that, when you let go of the ideas of who you're supposed to be, of what you're supposed to be, and just start concentrating really, really hard on the next thing that God wants you to do, even though your brain may be screaming, wait a minute, I'm looking at the pattern down the line, and this is going to be terrible. I'm going to lose this that I don't want to lose, or I'm not going to get this that I want so terribly bad. Said, your part of that job is that you're going to try real, real hard to do the next right thing instead of what you want to do. They said, you quit trying to figure out what you need to do relationship-wise. You quit trying to figure out how you're going to get out of the hole financially. And you start acting like that fellow that we just described, and we think it'll work just fine. Well, I want to tell you, I went back to Louisville. And I told Bob again at break, I said, you know, these things don't get clear to me right away. Because when I got on the plane to leave Cleveland to go back to Louisville, I wasn't aware that I had had a real important event happen in my sobriety. I certainly wasn't aware that an important event connected with step 6 and 7 had happened. But I got back on Sunday. On Tuesday, I went to a meeting there in Louisville that I hadn't been to in over 2 years, and the last time I'd been to it, it had been just an open discussion meeting. Well, I went, it was a noon meeting. I went, and they had turned it into a step meeting, and they were on step 6. That weekend, I took a lady friend on a motorcycle trip down to the Smoky Mountains, and after I'd been there a couple of days, I decided I needed to go to a meeting, and it was really raining hard. So I get on this motorcycle in this pouring rain, and I go over a mountain, and the meeting isn't where they had told me that it was, so I had to go to the police station. This motorcycle is pouring rain, and they told me where the meeting really was, and I walk in about 20 minutes late, and they're talking about step 6. So it began to kind of sink in. Now, what happened was that I began to do this, and I began to do it so poorly. Again, for those that were here last night, let me assure you that my spiritual growth, to the extent that I've had it, and I'll be honest, I believe that by the grace of God, starting from where I started, I've had an awful lot of spiritual growth. It has never come from just being on a spiritual beam and going straight up, you know, and not making mistakes. My spiritual growth has been the failing sometimes 100 times a day, being overtaken by self-will and knocked down on my butt in the dust sometimes 100 times a day, and remembering, oh yeah, one time I did a 3rd step, and that was when I made a decision I'm going to try to do it God's way instead of mine. And I now have got a realization of what that 7th step, 6th and 7th step really are. I'm going to quit trying to figure out what I'm supposed to be, and I'm just going to try to do that next right thing and leave it up to my God. And I have faltered so badly on that, just stumbling and falling to the extent that it would just seem like it couldn't possibly be working. I was doing so badly. And guess what? My God doesn't require perfection. My God doesn't even require consistency. He or she seems to be tickled to death with persistence. And I truly believe that my spiritual, I don't believe all the failures and the starting over are interruptions of my spiritual growth. I believe that is my spiritual growth. I believe that's the only spiritual growth I have, is that willingness to start over, that willingness to get up, that willingness to believe that my God's forgiveness is in fact boundless, and that I need it in the smallest things in my life, and I need it in the biggest things in my life, and that it's always available to me when I'm willing to take it. When I'm willing to say, oops, I'm sorry, Mom, Dad, I did it again. But here's my hand again. I'm still feeling scared to death, but I'm going to take that next step, even though we don't know where we're going. Then the question becomes real quickly, how did that work? Well, let me tell you how it worked. As I mentioned last night, if God had said to me in May of 1990, Don, I've been listening to this whining all these years, and I've got a belly full. And there's a pencil and a piece of paper, and I want you to list just precisely what you want in every area of your life. In your relationships with the opposite sex, in your law practice, in your finances, in your life in AA, in your friends, in your relationship with your daughter, in the house you live in, the cars you drive, everything right down the line. And I had made that list as best I could comprehend, the best that I could imagine for me in May of 1990, 9 years sober. And I'd given that list to God, and God said, here, St. Pete, make sure he gets it. I'm tired of that whining. And I had gotten everything I asked for